thank you for joining us for this installment of the Charlotte Works podcast. I will be your host for this episode. My name is Kevin Loux. I'm the Director of Labor Market Intelligence here at Charlotte Works. And today we've got joining us a bunch of data experts, local and national, to talk a little bit more about the economic impact of COVID-19. And so joining us today, I have Heath Dillard from the Charlotte Regional Visitors Authority. I've got Alyssa Brown from the City of Charlotte. I have Alanna Williams with Opportunity Insights and Chuck McShane with the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance. And so I just kind of wanted to talk today a little bit about a couple of different tools that our organizations have released to help people make sense of the economic impact around COVID-19 and just get some thoughts and perspective on what's going on. And so the first thing I really wanted to highlight is as a result of this pandemic, our organizations here locally in Charlotte have come together to release a regional dashboard around some of these economic indicators around COVID-19. And part of that is really understanding that while we have fewer resources than we might have had in the past, collaboration is more important than ever as the need is greater than ever to serve businesses and job seekers. And so on that note, I just kind of wanted to touch base on, what we're seeing and give a high level overview. And you can obviously check out the dashboard after the podcast. But with that, I'll just kind of kick it over to you, Chuck, to kind of get a lay of the land in terms of what's been the scope of the impact of the pandemic on businesses. And then have there been any insights you found insightful or surprising?
Thanks, Kevin. I think the main, as you mentioned, collaboration has been one of the key areas that we've focused on going through this. This is really, it's an overused word, but it's really a very unprecedented time. We've never experienced anything like this. The speed which with this affected businesses is really shocking when you think about it. We just had some numbers released yesterday that showed really how the bottom fell out on our industries, particularly the service sector industries, accommodations, retail, and I know Heath will talk a little bit more about that. One of the insights we found is how we're all being affected by this in some way or another, but it's definitely affecting different industries in a very disparate way. So if you think about how this happened, it's sort of backwards where how a recession typically happens. This really shut down the local sector industries first. And then has flowed through the traded sector industry. So we've seen with our surveying over time, it's really hitting the hotels and restaurants first, starting to hit the manufacturers when you look at supply chain issues second, and then the third wave has been office work, and that's still working its way through the professional services sector. So that was really one of the more surprising parts of this, more sort of happening in reverse of typical recessions. And I would say really at a high level, it's shown how interconnected all of our industries really are. When you think about how supply chains in China affected how the goods that were served here, so you think about supply chain issues, you're usually thinking about manufacturers, but we also found that a lot of our restaurants and retailers were having issues with supply chain as we move forward. So I think that's going to be it was a real eye opener just to show how interconnected various industries are. And actually, Bloomberg had a really good piece on this yesterday, showing the connections between industries and how layoffs are going to flow through them. But I would say interconnectedness it's really highlighted that interconnectedness of all of our industries.
Yeah. And that's great. And I think you already touched on this a little bit, but are there any kind of future projections or implications you're seeing post-pandemic for businesses going forward?
I mean, I think the obvious ones, right? Digitization. We're sitting here on Zoom today. That's going to be a continued thing. Again, I think this is going to affect different areas differently, right? If you look at only about 37% of jobs can be done fully at home, and most of those are higher paying ones. And then if you look at the unemployment rates for the Charlotte region that just came out yesterday, we saw 57% job loss in leisure and hospitality versus 2% job loss in finance.
Yeah.
So I think that this has the potential one, it's opening our eyes to more of the disparities, but it also has a potential to heighten some of these disparities as well.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point to bring up, Chuck, again, talking about some of the job loss. One of the things that we've been thinking about and focusing on is understanding if we look at the unemployment claims as a percentage of the total U.S. workforce, with the newest numbers that were recently released, the additional 1.8 million people filing for unemployment, we are over 43 million people nationally that have filed for unemployment. And that's around 27% of the U.S. workforce. So while we know the unemployment rate is only around 15%, and we'll get the new number tomorrow, the unemployment claims as a percentage of the total workforce, that is a much more current indicator, and that allows us to track the scope of this pandemic and how many people have been impacted. And again, just for an example, we've had over 100,000 people file for unemployment in Mecklenburg County alone through the end of April. And there are about 11 million people nationally that have filed since the end of April. So we expect that to continue to grow as well. But again, just kind of building off of what you were talking about, Chuck, and some of the industries that were most hardest hit, we all know one of them has been the hospitality industry. And so very excited to have Heath Dillard with the Regional Visitors Authority to talk about this and to kind of give us a feel for what the impact has been and kind of what are some of the projections on the hospitality industry and specifically with hotel occupancy.
Yeah, and our industry, hospitality and leisure, is very labor intensive. It represents, while not as big of a percent of our local GDP, it represents at full employment, 1 in 9 people in our area work in this industry. And in 2019, that total was a little more than 147,000 people. The April job numbers for the industry were down to 60,000, just under 60,000 people, right? And so you're talking about 90,000 people on average who were working in the industry were not working. And that's not always reflected in the unemployment numbers, right? So the unemployment is a piece of it, and then there's a much bigger number sort of outside of that. Chuck alluded to it, right? But it was the industry that was sort of first hit. It's an industry that thrives on social gathering, and in a time when social gathering is not allowed, it basically just stopped. We've gotten tax data from rental cars, from food and beverage sales, from hotel sales, and so when we look across those different sectors of this industry, and it doesn't represent all of the sectors, but at least the 3 that we can have relevant real-time data on. The food and beverage is one that can be somewhat sustained more so than the others because there's a local demand. And so the efforts of the community really rallying around this industry and understanding the importance of these jobs to so many people, and the pitch in and take out campaign that our own organization put forth, we saw, even with all of those efforts, we saw tax revenues decrease for those 2 months by almost 55%, which was the good news out of the sector. Hotel revenues over that time period dipped to they fell by almost 75%. Hotel occupancy at the bottom was around 23% a night. So Mecklenburg County has somewhere around 28,000 hotels on a nightly basis available for rent. And so we saw those numbers dip below 6,000 at the bottom, and that was around April the 11th. The good news is we've seen very, very incremental growth for 7 consecutive weeks, which is great news. It's, you got to really look hard to see the growth because it's not very big. But we crossed the 30% occupancy threshold. We're right around 31%. We're selling about 2,000 rooms more per night today than we were a month and a half ago. And so when you look for some glimmers of good news, there are some real small ones there. And then the other sector of revenues that we've looked at are the rental car. And so rental car sales in our area are very directly correlated with the O&D passenger traffic at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. And those have been the most hard hit. And so they don't represent as big of a share because Charlotte's still very much a drive market in terms of visitors. but those tax revenues are down 92% compared to where they were a year ago through April and March and April. And so it really paints a picture of an industry that really got stopped in its tracks. As we start to turn the page and look forward, we're looking at travel sentiment, consumer sentiment on a weekly basis, and we're trying to understand from all the different types of potential travelers, from regional leisure travel to group meeting, sports event, to corporate business travel, which represents about 50% of the hotel demand in the Charlotte area. When would that come back and to what degree? And right now there's still a lot of uncertainty, and people's beliefs around health and safety are going to play a very important role in when they're ready to go back. We do have some confidence that Charlotte is poised to recover faster maybe than the U.S. average overall, because we are a regional drive destination predominantly. 75% of all of our visitors arrive via car from 250 miles away. We're seeing sentiment data that would suggest people are looking for regional proximity in terms of their travel in the short term, that they are replacing vacations with staycations, that they're replacing long haul travel and air travel with short haul or drive market travel. And all of that is sort of right in our wheelhouse, right? Is the U.S. will see international travel take the longest to recover, and then domestic air travel before that, and then more regional proximate drive market will be the first to recover. And Charlotte is really poised to maybe recover faster than others. So when we look at forecasts, we see that we could potentially be at about 80% of 2019 performance levels by the end of 2020. Which, if we were in 19 and somebody told us that, that'd be incredibly scary, because that would be worse than any recession that we have on record. But where we sat in mid-April, that's really quite an optimistic view of how things are going to shake out. And so we're working constantly with meeting planners to understand their concerns, and the travel industry, not only in the venues that we manage, but restaurant owners, museum managers, other attractions, how they operate their businesses will completely change because of this concerns around health and safety. And that's been our early focus, and that will continue as people start to become more comfortable in getting out of their home and, doing some of the small steps to growing this industry back again.
Yeah. And that's great. And I think you've already kind of touched on the future projections, the uncertainty around when travel will return, people really shifting from vacations to staycations. But again, talking about the importance of collaboration and how we're really being intentional about working together. Is there anything else that the CRVA is doing to respond to this crisis, or things that they would encourage community members to do to help the hospitality industry?
Yeah, I mentioned our early efforts. Really there was no reason, and there's still no reason today to advertise travel to Charlotte, right? Because the sentiment around health and safety still outweighs. We are seeing quite a bit of pent-up demand. People are ready to leave the house. They want to go do some of the things that they are accustomed to doing. They want to visit friends and relatives. But as of today, those health and safety concerns still outweigh the excitement to get out and start to do those again. And so our early efforts were really focused on locals and continuing to remind them and to create awareness of the really great assets that we have and the growing culinary scene that we have, and how important our local spending is to those jobs within this industry. And so as we start to transition forward, we'll have an even bigger campaign focused on locals, and then we'll start to spread that out as we go. We're working with all of tourism, sector partners, working with them on some of the research and data that we're seeing that maybe they don't have access to. understanding general consumer sentiment, understanding where the industry has to move from a cleanliness and a sanitization standpoint. And then we have within the county, we have something like 240 hotels, and in Uptown, more than 20 hotels. And we're working with them constantly as we work with meeting planners to reschedule events that have been canceled and then postponed and potentially postponed again. And so our teams are working maybe harder than they ever have to reschedule business that Charlotte had already won, and to try to maintain as much demand as we can, even if it means shifting meetings that were scheduled for 2020 into 2021 and beyond. So it's not only trying to shore up as much of the short term as we can, it's also about laying the foundation and groundwork for a really healthy tourism economy in the long term as well.
Yeah. And that's great. And I think thank you for everything you're doing as well. And that kind of ties into the next thing, which is, as we know, with a lot of businesses being closed and this focus on the long term and economic development, making sure those jobs come back to our region. I know the city has been really focused on business development right now, and then also understanding the scope of impact of this pandemic on economic development. And so I wanted to talk with you, Alyssa, about how the city's efforts have shifted pre and post COVID with respect to business and economic development.
Yeah, we've definitely noticed a lot of shifts in the way that we do economic development and business recruitment overall. It's a very touch heavy process, as you can imagine. You have business owners and CEOs and site consultants coming out to different cities, and that's not possible now. So we're really shifting our efforts on rebuilding the economy, bringing jobs here that will help the workers that were displaced by COVID-19. We know the employment rate will stay higher than what it was for a while, probably into next year. And so a real priority for us is to identify companies and industries that are expanding and really sell Charlotte to them, show them why it's a good market, so that they bring their jobs here and provide a lot more opportunity. So we do have projects in the pipeline. Luckily, our prospects didn't stop or come to a complete halt. We're working with companies that are in the finance and technology industries. Logistics, that's going to be a big play, as I think the shift kind of from direct retail to product like being delivered to your house directly was really accelerated by this pandemic. And so you're going to see a huge growth in transportation and logistics sectors. So we see that as a really big opportunity for the Charlotte region. And then kind of like back office and call center type jobs. And we've seen companies here in Charlotte in those industries expand. A few companies announced over this quarantine period that they're hiring rapidly. And so we've been trying to work with those companies, connecting our workforce development partners like Charlotte Works, Goodwill, and others directly to those jobs. So that's the good news, is that there is still job opportunity. We have to be really intentional about finding job opportunities that will build our economy, provide good wages and stable employment. So that's really what we're focused on. Another thing that we have been working on during this kind of quarantine period specifically, we launched a tech talent study in partnership with the Alliance. Chuck and I have been working pretty closely on that. And the goal of that study is to really understand our technology talent market that we have now, and either, define where gaps are, define where opportunities are, so that we can be really intentional about building a tech workforce. While we do want to attract or make Charlotte an attractive market for technology professionals across the country, we really want to focus on building our own tech workforce in partnership with our educational institutions in the region, but also kind of the untraditionally thought of tech educators like Tech Talent South and the Workforce Investment Network, because those are the organizations that provide tech employment and education for people who may not be able to go to college, may not be able to get a 4-year degree. So really kind of providing a spectrum of opportunity to build that tech workforce. And a couple other things that have shifted in economic development. I think a big thing is real estate. That's especially in the office sector, you're going to see a big shift. And I think that a lot of companies are trying to reconfigure what they thought was going to be the hot thing for offices. I know a lot of the big companies here were moving to the hot desk type of model, which clearly in this post-pandemic world is not the best idea, sharing desks. So we're going to have to really pay attention to what office spaces, what the protocols for those are, and how to reconfigure Charlotte's office spaces in partnership with our real estate partners and figure out how we're going to kind of sell that product to companies that are looking to come here or companies that are expanding here in the region.
Yeah, and that's great. And I know the city has been putting together a couple of different task force and being intentional about responding to business needs, to the airport needs. And so can you talk a little bit about kind of like what's coming out of those task force and what people might be able to expect from like a business owner standpoint?
So the city has launched initially a grant program for micro businesses. That was last month. And the city has also received a good chunk of CARES Act money. And the strategy for deploying that funding is kind of two-pronged. One, and it's kind of under this umbrella called Survive and Thrive. So the survive prong of this strategy is really helping businesses get through this initial period, get funding for rent, utilities, keeping their employees on the payroll. And so I believe towards the end of this month, a really large small business grant program will be deployed. They're still kind of working out the details, but I believe around $35 million will be eligible, or $35 million will be available to eligible small businesses. And then the second part of the program, of the strategy, is going to focus on helping businesses thrive in this post-pandemic world. And that's going to focus on a variety of things, from helping businesses come up with business plans, resiliency plans, as well as upskilling workforce. So we're really looking to partner with our local workforce partners and help people who are displaced upskill into either new jobs or kind of get on the next track of their careers. So that part of the strategy is still being worked out in the task force committee that was created by City Council. And our team is working really closely with them. And a key part of that, and where I've really valued the collaboration among all of us, is the data really drives that strategy development. So without knowing what industries are most impacted and what workers have been laid off versus furloughed, and knowing how many of the furloughs are turning into permanent layoffs, that'll really help drive the strategy and determine where need is for not only workforce programming, but which the small businesses and what industries they're in, kind of helping being intentional about deploying funding to those businesses.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. Again, thanks for sharing that. That's great news for businesses and kind of, encapsulating just how this regional dashboard we've released can be used by people like us and people in any industry. So it's just getting that information together to make informed decisions. But really, I think another very important part of this conversation is something everyone in Charlotte is very familiar with. And so if you're not already familiar with it, the whole concept of economic mobility being a challenge pre-COVID, we know it's probably only going to get worse now. With the Chetty study, the 50 out of 50 report, we're pleased to have Alanna Williams with Opportunity Insights joining us today to talk a little bit about what they've been seeing, what they've been doing, and some of their work, and how it's how it's impacted what's going on nationally. So Alanna, with that, I'll kind of turn it over to you if you want to give a little overview of your organization and talk a little bit about what you guys have been up to.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. First of all, so much for inviting me to join this conversation. And so I work at Opportunity Insights, which is a national organization housed at Harvard University and run by Professors Raj Chetty, John Friedman, and Nathan Hendren. And I think we're probably best known in Charlotte for being the 50 out of 50 Chetty Study Lab. So have been keeping a pulse on what's going on in Charlotte. I'm working with folks like Kevin locally to think about different strategies to improve economic mobility more broadly. And as Kevin said, I think this crisis will amplify some of those disparities, but also presents a moment to really acknowledge what's going on and try to push back and leverage the moment so that there can be more investments in economic mobility strategies. So in particular, I can talk a little bit about the economic tracker that we've released recently. So I think the local expertise that have already been discussed is like definitely going to provide the best context for what's going on in Charlotte specifically. I think what we can additionally bring is some comparative perspective and some additional real-time measures, because that's really where we saw a gap as this crisis unfolded, was that it was happening so rapidly, but the data wasn't quite keeping up with it. So we partnered with a series of private companies to try to get a better sense of how different economic measures were developing and the situations that those measures represent. So the tool's called the Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker. It's at tracktherecovery.org. In addition to more traditional measures like unemployment insurance, we're also pulling in things like unemployment rates and wages at small businesses, small business openings and revenues, consumer credit card spending, job postings, engagement with online education tools, time spent outside of the home. And where we can, we're trying to break those down by industry or subgroup, and then that's available both at the national and the local level. So I think a lot of what we've been seeing kind of conforms to what folks have already discussed. Like Heath talked about, you can see how the different industries are being impacted, especially like leisure and hospitality. What our data allows you to do is then take kind of a comparative perspective to see how these differences vary across the country. So whereas he said like the leisure and hospitality industry looks like it's maybe picking up a little bit in North Carolina, like the DC tourism and leisure and hospitality industry has not recovered at all and is still about 80% below its level in January. So I think those types of disparities geographically can be really helpful for informing both just benchmarking where different communities are in the recovery process and potentially where resources need to be targeted. Some other metrics are that like in North Carolina, you can see that small business employment is down with our measure around 35% since January. Massachusetts is up to 60%, but South Carolina is down to 20%. So these like present really interesting questions of like what's going on there? Are they different policies that are overlaying here? I think one of the things that really stood out when we started to look at this data was that despite a lot of the reopening orders and lifting of the stay-at-home orders, that people weren't really opening up in a business sense and a spending sense, that wasn't really happening. And so as times progressed, it's picked up a little bit in some places, but still stays pretty stagnant in others. And I think that goes back to the point that he's already raised, that like the first and foremost consideration in some of these recoveries should be the health situation. Like people aren't going to feel super confident going out and spending money or bringing on new employees if there's still a lot of COVID cases and people dying. So I think that is something we've definitely seen in the data. And something else I want to flag is that this crisis is still evolving. There's a lot of learnings we don't really know yet. So one of the things we hope is that as recoveries can progress in different ways across the country, I think this tool that we provided will be able to help people assess progress and also assess how potential policies that are coming down the pipeline are having an impact. We also want to be able to add additional variables so that we can really better understand these disparities by not only geography, but population, and more industry data, so people can get really granular and really dive in for themselves as well and see what they're seeing in their local communities and how it compares to other places. So I would definitely encourage everyone to take a look at it and try to explore. And then we hope kind of in the longer term that this tool will be helpful for just gaining a better understanding of economic dynamics more broadly, both during times of shock and crisis, and during normal times, like just how does spending proceed, how are job postings looking in certain areas, and it's something that we're planning on keeping updated and continually improving on. So we're hoping this can be a real tool for people.
Yeah. And it's fantastic. So if you haven't had a chance to go check that out as well as our regional dashboard, again, go to either Opportunity Insights website or the Alliance website or Charlotte Works website, and you can find our dashboards. But one of the other reasons I was really excited about having Alanna on was to talk a little bit more about some of the disproportionality we're seeing in the data. And if you look at Mecklenburg County specifically, for example, the story we see in unemployment claim data is that women, communities of color, and younger individuals have been disproportionately unemployed. So we go back to the economic mobility study. We already understand that your race, zip code, gender was more predictive of your economic outcomes than other factors. And so thinking about, as Alanna said, using this window of opportunity to really think creatively and respond with targeted strategies to address where we see disproportionality and really create more equitable solutions. I know another big portion of Opportunity Insights focus is really around using this data to inform policy. And so they've got an entire policy department. And so I know they've been utilizing the economic recovery tracker to kind of talk about a little bit of policy recommendations. So is there anything you can talk about, even just briefly, just, how have you been able to use the recovery tracker to inform local policy, and what have you been seeing?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing I mentioned a little bit already was that the health and safety component of this is really key, that without appropriate public health measures in place, that people might not really feel confident restarting the economy, that should really be the first and foremost consideration. And I'm super glad you brought up that disparity piece, Kevin, because I think that's something that you also see in the data and in people's lived experiences, in both in this crisis and outside, as we're seeing particularly in this moment. There's one particular example of data from the tracker that I think is pretty illustrative of this. It's a little less workforce related, but I think it's both illustrative and related to developing a skilled workforce, which is one of the variables that we have on here, is about engagement with educational tools. So tools that are used usually in the classroom that students then engage with at home. And so we can see how this educational engagement changed across high and low poverty zip codes. And whereas levels of engagement looked really similar before this crisis, by April 5th, you see engagement in high opportunity zip codes was only down about 20%, a little bit less, compared to being down over 40% in low income zip codes. And then the gap only grew from there. So I think that's just one illustrative example of how this crisis is really playing out differently in different communities, and how it's just exacerbating a lot of these issues that are already there. So I think one of the biggest lessons that we have been able to take away from the tracker is so far that impacts are different by place, by population, by industry, and we should be really cognizant of that when we're focusing relief policies to focus on these hardest hit areas and populations. And then as we already discussed, really leveraging this moment to push some of the economic mobility conversations forward.
Absolutely.
Let me just add, I think that having the real-time data is so essential for this, because in the past we were dealing with data that may have been 2 or 3 years old, lagged in terms of, especially when you got down to the neighborhood level. And that's not as convincing to a policymaker as real-time data. So that's one of the things I think this moment we can take forward, is adding more real-time data that shows, that matches what people are experiencing. I think can have a much more impactful way of changing policy. So I'm really excited about that opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chuck. And again, that's like we were talking about, just thinking about how can we leverage this moment. I know from a workforce development standpoint, we're really thinking about how can we, again, target our solutions to serve those individuals with the greatest need, and think about utilizing social investment strategies to really address this unemployment crisis and reinvigorate our economy. And so with that, again, I thank everyone for taking the time today. Thanks to all of our panelists and for providing that great insight.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kevin.